It was just another ordinary morning in a city where the days seemed to repeat themselves like an old song. But for a young woman named Isabella, it wouldn't be just another day. In fact, it would be the beginning of something that would change her life forever, even if she didn't know it yet. Before we start the story, tell us where you're watching us from. Your presence makes all the difference for us. We hope you enjoy the story. Isabella grew up in an isolated orphanage on the outskirts of a big city. She was never sure where she came from, who her parents were, or why she had been left as a baby, wrapped in a blanket and with a single object next to her, a heart-shaped necklace with a small golden streak running through the center. It was the only memory of a past that no one could explain. No record. No clue. Nothing but that necklace, and a strange feeling that something, or someone, was still waiting for her somewhere. At the orphanage, Isabella was not the loudest nor the quietest. But there was something in her eyes that caught the eye, a mixture of sweetness and strength, as if she had been born to resist the world. And that's exactly what he did for 19 years. While many gave up or surrendered to circumstances, she held on to hope. He nurtured within himself the desire to find answers. She didn't know where this feeling came from, but he accompanied her day and night, as if fate was whispering to her that there was still something big to happen. That morning, while arranging her few belongings in a worn bag, Isabella paused for a moment in front of the cracked mirror of the collective room where she slept. She ran her fingers over the necklace, as she did every time she felt insecure. And there, with teary eyes and a tight heart, he smiled. A small smile, but full of courage. The reason? For the first time in her life, Isabella was about to leave the orphanage. With the help of the director, who always treated her like a daughter, she had gotten a job as a maid in a luxurious mansion belonging to one of the most respected businessmen in the region, Edward Bennett. Edward was a household name. Owner of a real estate chain, constant presence at charity events, father of a family, or at least that's what everyone thought. What many didn't know, and what he did everything to hide, was that there was something in his life that tormented him night and day, the disappearance of his daughter. A silent tragedy that occurred 17 years ago that has never had an explanation. Since that day, Edward has never been the same. His smile became a facade, his gestures colder. He immersed himself in work as a way to escape the pain, but the emptiness remained there, always remembering what he had lost. Her daughter's only physical memory was a heart-shaped necklace, identical to the one Isabella wore around her neck since she was a baby. Coincidence? At that moment, neither Isabella nor Edward imagined the whirlwind of events that was approaching. But fate, silent and relentless, had already set everything in motion. As she walked through the gate of the orphanage for the last time, Isabella didn't look back. She knew that the life she left behind was part of who she was, but what came next would define who she would become. As she got into the car that would take her to the Bennett mansion, she felt her heart race. Fear. Anxiety. Hope. Maybe all at the same time. The driver barely exchanged words with her. The streets passed quickly by the window, the buildings got bigger and bigger, and the cars more luxurious. And then, when the gates of the mansion finally opened, Isabella understood that she was about to enter a world completely different from anything she had ever known. What she didn't know was that this place held the key to her past, and that the simple act of entering that house, with his old necklace hanging around his neck, would be the beginning of a sequence of discoveries that would not only change his life, but it would reveal a truth buried for nearly 2 decades. But why did Edward react that way when he saw that necklace? Who really was Isabella? And why would anyone hide the truth about their past for so long? These questions still have no answer, but from now on, you will follow everything, step by step, as if you were living this story from the inside. And believe me, this is just the beginning. The first thing Isabella noticed when she got out of the car was the silence. Not the usual silence of quiet mornings, but a kind of dense, almost solemn silence that seemed to envelop that mansion like an invisible veil. The garden, perfectly trimmed, the marble statues lined up along the path, the bushes cut with precision. Everything there exuded an impeccable, almost uncomfortable order. It was as if the whole place was frozen in time, waiting for something, or someone, to break that stillness. She barely had time to absorb the environment when the main door opened. A tall man, with a closed expression and impeccable suit, appeared in the doorway. It was Thomas, the chief of the employees, known for his rigidity and for never showing emotion. His eyes fixed for a moment on Isabella's necklace, but he said nothing. He just gestured for her to come in. The mansion inside was even more imposing. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like jewels, the floors shone like mirrors, and every detail looked like something out of a European palace. Isabella walked slowly, feeling small in that universe so different from anything she had ever known. The sound of his own footsteps echoed in the wide, cold corridors. Thomas led her through a few rooms, briefly explaining his future tasks. The tone of voice was direct, almost robotic. Here, punctuality and perfection are not only expected. They are mandatory, he said without even looking at her. Isabella just nodded, swallowing hard. It was nothing new to be treated coldly. The world had never been kind to her, but there was something about the mansion that made her uneasy. As if she were being watched all the time, the room assigned to her was small but clean. A narrow bed, a dark wood dresser, and a window overlooking the back garden. It was there that, for the first time since she arrived, Isabella felt a little peace. The singing of birds, the soothing sound of water running from a nearby fountain. There was something in that garden that seemed to welcome her. Unlike the rest of the house, she hung her single bag on a hook in the wall and sat up on the bed, taking a deep breath. His head was still spinning with everything that had happened in the last few hours. It was as if she had been pushed into an unknown scenario, and now she had to learn all the rules of the game without any explanation. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate on Thomas's instructions or his new surroundings, his mind always turned to a single point, the subtle reaction, almost imperceptible but real, that the butler had when he saw his necklace. It wasn't just any look. There was hesitation, a second of surprise, perhaps even recognition. That didn't leave Isabella's head. The next day, just before dawn, Isabella was already up. He put on the uniform left on the dresser, tied his hair, and left towards the kitchen. The mansion was still sleeping, but some lights were on, and a faint smell of coffee hung in the air. As she organized the utensils and prepared the ingredients for the family breakfast, her thoughts returned again to her childhood at the orphanage. He remembered one particular occasion when he was about 7 years old. A volunteer at the orphanage had looked at Isabella's necklace for a long time and asked where it came from. At the time, the girl replied matter-of-factly, "I was with them when they found me." The woman just smiled sadly and whispered something that Isabella only now seemed to understand better. "This necklace has a story, and you'll find out one day." Was that day finally coming? Shortly thereafter, the members of the house began to appear, one by one. Servants, gardeners, assistants. Everyone followed a meticulous routine. But it was when Edward Bennet entered the kitchen, something rare, according to the employees themselves, that everything seemed to stop for a moment. Isabella was on her back, focused on cleaning a countertop, when she felt a strong presence behind her. As he turned around, he came face to face with the man whose photo he had seen countless times in newspapers and magazines. Tall, well-groomed gray hair, a serious look, and an imposing posture. But it was what he didn't say that caught his attention. Edward stood there, staring at the necklace around his neck, as if he had just seen a ghost. She frowned, confused. "Good morning, Mr. Bennet," he said, trying to keep his composure. Edward took a few seconds to answer. "That necklace. Where did you get that?" The question fell into the air like a stone thrown into the water, creating waves that Isabella still didn't know what kind of storm they would bring. His answer was simple but loaded with meaning. "I've had it since I can remember. He was always with me." Edward's gaze was lost for a moment, as if he were being dragged back to some painful point in the past. He said nothing more. He just nodded vaguely, picked up the bottle of water, and left the kitchen with slow steps. Isabella stood still for a moment, her heart racing. It was as if something inside her had been activated. The necklace she had always worn out of habit, out of memory, now seemed to have awakened something much greater than she could have imagined, and at that moment, without knowing the exact reason, Isabella was sure of one thing: her life would never be the same again. The next few days passed quietly, almost as if the mansion was waiting for something. Isabella fulfilled her duties with discipline, always remaining attentive, always present, but never in excess. Her demeanor was discreet and careful, and in the eyes of those who didn't pay much attention, she was just another employee. However, inside, she lived in turmoil. Since the awkward encounter with Mr. Bennet in the kitchen, his head had not stopped. She relived that morning over and over again, trying to find some meaning in the way he looked at her necklace. It was not simple curiosity. That was different. It was as if he had recognized something. Something that she herself could not explain. And even though she said almost nothing, Edward left a question in the air, a question that now seemed to scream inside her. Why did that necklace arouse him so much? In the solitude of her room, Isabella began to observe the necklace with different eyes. For the first time, she didn't just see it as a childhood memory but as a real clue. That was not just any jewel. It had a different design, almost handmade, and despite the years, it was incredibly well preserved. She tried to open the zipper, look inside, and look for some symbol or some recording. Nothing. Try as he might, the past remained an enigma. But inside her, something had changed. It was as if now an insistent voice whispered that she was closer to the answers than ever. One afternoon, while organizing the books in the library, one of the tasks she liked to do most, Isabella found an old album hidden behind some thick volumes. It was a hardcover notebook with golden details worn by time. Curious, she sat on the floor and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with old photos of the Bennet family. Trips, parties, simple moments in the garden, and then, in one of the photos, time seemed to stop. It was a small picture, a portrait of a girl about 2 years old, sitting on Edward's lap, smiling. The girl wore a necklace identical to his. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes were fixed on the image, trying to absorb every detail. That child. She looked familiar. Did that make sense? Was it just an impression? Or was there something else there? Could that necklace not only be similar, but exactly the same? Before he could analyze further, he heard footsteps approaching. He closed the album and quickly hid it in the place where he found it. Thomas entered the library soon after, his gaze always attentive. "Is everything in order around here?" he asked coldly. "Yes, sir. I'm just finishing organizing the bookshelf," she replied, trying to look natural. Thomas nodded and left without saying anything else. But Isabella stood there, motionless, her heart racing. That photo was the first concrete piece of a puzzle that she didn't even know she was putting together. That night, sleep did not come. Isabella lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house in the distance, the creaking of the old structures, the wind rushing through the cracks, the calm breathing of the world around her. But inside her, nothing was calm, and then she asked herself the question she had been avoiding since the first day in that mansion: what if I'm that kid in the picture? The thought seemed absurd at first glance. But the more she reflected, the more she felt something fit. The necklace. The absence of information about its origin. The way Edward looked at her. And now, that image is lost in time. But if that were true, why hasn't anyone ever looked for her? Why was she left alone in foster care? And more importantly, who left it there? Isabella didn't have those answers. But she was determined to find out. For the first time, his curiosity wasn't just emotional. It was an inner calling. It was about knowing who she really was. The next day arrived with a cloudy sky, and the weather seemed to perfectly reflect his state of mind. In the kitchen, she worked in silence, always attentive to the movements of the house. He watched the servants, the conversations of the other employees, and Edward's schedule. It all seemed routine, but for Isabella, every detail could now hide a clue. She needed help. But who to turn to? Thomas didn't seem trustworthy. And Edward? Well, he looked confused, maybe even in denial. Alone, Isabella knew she would have to tread carefully. If there were secrets in that house, and now she was sure there were, then maybe it wasn't safe to trust anyone. As he cleaned the breakfast dishes, he glanced at the large staircase that led to the upper floor. Upstairs was Edward's office. It was where he spent most of the day. And maybe it was there that she would find the answers she was looking for, but was she ready for what she might discover? Isabella didn't usually break rules. In fact, his entire life has been shaped by boundaries, schedules, and surveillance. From a young age, she learned that every mistake had consequences, sometimes silent, but always striking. However, that night, something inside her spoke louder. An urgency that surpassed fear, a need that could no longer be ignored. It was almost midnight when she left her room. The corridors were plunged into darkness, lit only by small lights embedded in the walls. She knew exactly where she wanted to go, Edward's office. He moved carefully, his footsteps silent on the polished wooden floor. His heart was pounding, and his hands were sweating. The office handle was unlocked. He pushed the door slowly and entered. The environment was exactly as she imagined, sober, imposing, with dark furniture and bookshelves full of books. A desk in the center of the room dominated the space, and behind it, a large window overlooked the garden. Isabella approached, looking around. There were stacked folders, old notebooks, and a wooden box stored in the corner of the table. She opened the box carefully. Inside, he found envelopes, old photos, documents, and, finally, a folder with the name Emily engraved in gold letters. When she opened it, she saw several images of the same girl in the photo she had found in the library. Photos of birthdays, children's drawings, and medical exams. The last sheet contained a note in shaky handwriting, disappeared on the 21st of June, 17 years ago. Isabella felt the ground disappear under her feet. Emily, that girl. It had to be her. The features, the necklace, the age. Everything fell into place. The confirmation was not official, but deep down, she already knew. That explained the emptiness he had always carried. He explained the absence of a past, the silences of the adults around him, and the necklace without origin. But while the revelation brought a kind of peace, it also opened a new wound. Why did her family never seek her out? Why did they leave her in foster care? In an attempt to understand better, she continued to rummage through the papers. He found newspaper clippings from the time, with articles about the disappearance of little Emily Bennett. The news described the tragedy as a mystery. The police believed in kidnapping, but there were no witnesses, no clues, only the sudden disappearance during an afternoon in the park. Among the documents, there was also a report from a private investigation. Isabella scanned her notes. There were names, dates, connections made, and places visited. And one detail caught his attention, a name underlined more than once, Michael. She didn't know any Michael. There was no one with that name in the mansion. And then she wondered, was that the name of the man who left her at the orphanage? Was he involved in her disappearance? He put everything back in his briefcase and closed the box. He was already leaving the office when he heard a sound in the background. A gentle creak. Steps froze. For a second, he thought about hiding, but it was too late. The door opened slowly, and there he was, Edward. His eyes were fixed on her. First with surprise. Then with something else. Pain. Fear. Hope. What are you doing here? His voice came out not angry, but heavy. Isabella hesitated, but she didn't lie. I needed to know. He replied firmly, even with a choked voice. I needed to understand who I am. There was a long silence between them. Neither of them knew exactly what to say. Until Edward took a few steps, entered the room, and closed the door behind him. He sat down in the armchair in front of the desk and ran his hands over his face. You saw it, didn't you? The photos, the papers. Isabella nodded slowly. I found this girl in one of the photos. She looks like me. And the necklace. He looked at the pendant around her neck. His eyes lit up, as if something inside him was breaking. That necklace belonged to my daughter. Isabella sat up, still terrible with her own breathing. Her name was Emily. Edward nodded. Yes. Emily disappeared when she was 2 years old. We were in the park. A moment of carelessness, and she disappeared. We searched for years. The police investigated, I hired detectives, I spent everything I could, but we never found anything. No sign. Hitherto, silence fell between them once more. A dense, heavy silence, full of unanswered questions. "What if," Isabella began, her voice almost a whisper, "what if I'm her?" Edward stared at her deeply. The words seemed impossible to pronounce, but they were there, between the two. "I don't want to delude myself, Isabella. But, something inside me says you can be my daughter." She didn't know what to answer. Part of him wanted to run, to deny everything. But another part, the stronger one, wanted to embrace that truth. "We need to be sure," Edward said. "Tomorrow, we're going to do a DNA test." Isabella nodded, teary-eyed. That night, in their separate rooms, neither of them could sleep. Because, for the first time, there was a real possibility, the answer to a lifetime of doubts could be just a few hours away. The day dawned heavy, the sky hidden under dense and heavy clouds. Isabella opened her eyes even before the alarm sounded. Sleeping was impossible after the night before. The confusion of thoughts, anticipation, and anxiety kept her awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heart racing by the minute. That morning, something she never imagined living was about to happen. She would take a DNA test to find out if she was really Edward Bennett's missing daughter. The simple idea seemed unreal. For many years, she believed she was invisible to the world. Now, there was someone who said he was willing to meet her. As she dressed, she looked once more at the necklace. That object, until then only an effective memory, had become the key to a possible reunion with its origin. It was as if all the pieces of a forgotten puzzle were finally beginning to fall into place. On the other side of the house, Edward was equally agitated. He tried to maintain a calm posture in front of the employees and the day's commitments, but internally, he was experiencing a battle. He was afraid to create hopes in vain. She had been wrong before. She had imagined faces similar to her daughter's in other people, and every time she was disappointed, she felt like she lost Emily again. But now it was different. There were signs he couldn't ignore. The necklace. The features. The traces in the gaze. And, above all, the inexplicable feeling of familiarity when he talked to Isabella. On the way to the laboratory, silence prevailed in the car. Isabella stared out the window, trying to control her breathing. Edward drove carefully, but from time to time, he cast discreet glances in his direction. There was something in the air, a sweet tension, almost like meeting someone you've known for a long time, even if you have no memories of it. The procedure was quick. Just a few saliva samples and signed documents. The lab employee was kind but direct. The result would take a few days. Isabella left the room feeling her heart even heavier. The weight would be unbearable. Back at the mansion, the days that followed were strange. Isabella continued to work, but with a slight difference. Now, Edward watched her more closely, and instead of the coldness of before, there was a shy care, an attempt to get closer without invading. On a rainy afternoon, while watering the plants in the garden, one of her favorite activities, Isabella heard light footsteps behind her. It was Edward. He approached slowly, without saying anything right away. He just stood there, next to her, watching the drops of water fall on the flowers. "Did you know," he said after a few minutes in silence, "that this garden was my daughter's favorite place?" Isabella turned her face away, surprised. Edward rarely talked about Emily. "I spent hours here with her," he continued, with a sad smile. "She loved to run among the flowers and to say that butterflies were her secret friends. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear her laugh." Edward's voice trembled a little, but he held his ground. "You know, there's something in you. Something is in your way. It's not just the necklace. It's the way you walk around here. As if I already knew this place, as if you were also part of you." Isabella felt a lump in her throat. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't find words. That conversation, that moment. Everything was so delicate. It wasn't just about blood or DNA. It was about belonging. About feelings that cannot be explained. Over time, the relationship between the two began to change subtly. Edward began to invite her to quick lunches on the porch to ask her about her childhood, her dreams, and what she liked to do in her free time. Isabella, even though she was insecure, began to open up little by little. She spoke of the cold nights at the orphanage, the forgotten birthdays, the times when she wondered why no one came to pick her up, and Edward listened. Carefully. With guilt. With love. That it was as if both were recognizing, little by little, the space they occupied in each other's lives. Not as a boss and employee, but as two halves of an interrupted history, and that perhaps could still be rewritten. But what if the test results said otherwise? What if all this was just a cruel coincidence of fate? This doubt hung over them like a shadow. And with each passing day, the expectation became more difficult to bear. The following days were a constant exercise in emotional balance. Isabella tried to keep up with the routine, but each simple task now carried the weight of waiting. Every glance exchanged with Edward brought a mixture of hope, fear, and a strange sense of familiarity that she couldn't explain. One morning, as he entered the living room to put away the cushions, he found Edward sitting alone, holding an old photograph. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on the image as if searching for answers that weren't there. "Is that her?" Isabella asked, unable to help herself. Edward looked up, surprised by the direct question. He held out the photo to her. "Yes," he murmured. "Emily, on the day you turned 2. The last photo we took together." Isabella took the image carefully. The girl had bright eyes and the same sweet smile she saw when she looked in the mirror. The sense of belonging intensified. There was no denying the similarities. "I remember flashes," she said hesitantly. "I don't know if they're real memories or things my mind has created. But sometimes when I'm here, I feel like I've been to this place before." Edward watched in silence. It was as if Isabella's every word brought up buried memories, feelings suffocated by time. "When you showed up with that necklace," he said, his voice breaking, "I felt like I was seeing a ghost. But at the same time, for the first time in many years, I felt hope." There was a long pause. "I've been looking for you for so long," he continued. "There were times when I no longer believed. That convinced me that perhaps it was better to accept and follow. But I never succeeded. Never." Isabella squeezed the photograph between her fingers. His pain was palpable. "But in a way, it was also yours. What if the test is negative?" he asked, breaking the silence with the question they both avoided. Edward sighed deeply. "If it's not you, I'll take it. But something tells me it is. Maybe you don't need a paper for that. There's something in your eyes, something I recognize. And even if science says otherwise, I think I already feel connected to you." The words hung in the air, and Isabella felt the tears form. It was strange how, in such a short time, a bond had begun to emerge between them. Not based on evidence or certainties, but on a feeling that transcended explanations. That afternoon, Edward decided to show Isabella something that no one else in that house knew existed. He led her to a wing of the mansion that had remained closed since Emily's disappearance. It was the girl's old room. When he opened the door, time seemed to recede. The room remained intact. The walls were soft shades of pink, a bookshelf full of toys still rested in the corner, and the small crib had been transformed into a children's bed, as if someone had waited for the return of a child who never returned. Isabella entered slowly, her eyes moving through every detail. He touched the stuffed animals carefully, ran his fingers through the children's books, and stopped in front of a small music box on the dresser. When I opened it, a soft and melancholic melody began to play, filling the room with an almost unbearable nostalgia. Edward stood in the doorway, unable to get in. It was as if that space kept not only objects but also wounds that never healed. "I came here every birthday to her," he said, his voice trembling. "I would put a flower on the bed and talk to it." He said how much he missed him, and how much he still believed that one day she would return. Isabella did not answer. She just walked up to him and hugged him. A simple gesture, but one that said more than any word. They stayed like this for a few minutes, silent, but connected by a shared pain, and, perhaps, by a bond that time has not been able to erase. 2 days later, the phone rang. That it was the laboratory. The result had arrived. Edward didn't want to wait. He called Isabella, took the car keys, and, together, they went to the place to get the envelope with the answer that could change everything. The path was silent. Edward's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Isabella, in the next seat, pressed the necklace against her chest as if looking for courage there. On the way back to the mansion, neither of them wanted to open the envelope immediately. They sat in the office. The envelope was placed on the table. And for a moment, they just looked at each other. "Are you ready?" Edward asked. "No. But we need to know," Isabella replied. He opened the envelope with trembling hands. He read the contents in silence, his eyes watering. When he finally looked up, he smiled. "It's you, Isabella. You are my daughter." She collapsed. The tears fell freely, and everything that had been trapped in his chest for so many years found its way out. Edward hugged her tightly, as if he wanted to make up for every lost second. At that moment, time stopped, and if you're feeling this story as much as we are, if she touched your heart in any way, don't forget to show your support. A simple click on like helps this story reach more people and makes all the difference so that we can continue to bring narratives like this to you. The confirmation of the exam brought a wave of emotion that took over the mansion. Edward and Isabella spent the next few days trying to get used to the new reality. It was strange but at the same time natural, as if an absent part of both had finally found its place. Long conversations, walks in the garden, more intimate dinners. The relationship between the two grew stronger every day. However, while father and daughter lived this late reunion, a shadow began to form discreetly at the back of the house. A silent gaze, a restrained tension, gestures that had previously gone unnoticed now became noticeable. Thomas's behavior, the butler, always so controlled, had shown signs of discomfort since Isabella had been officially recognized as part of the family. He avoided direct encounters, responded with short sentences, and his gaze, previously impassive, now carried something more, perhaps doubt, perhaps fear. Isabella noticed first. One morning, as he entered the kitchen, he noticed Thomas whispering something on the phone. As soon as she entered, he quickly hung up and pretended to organize dishes. The reaction was so abrupt that it was impossible not to notice. She didn't say anything at that moment. He was still assimilating everything that was happening around him, and he preferred to believe that it was just an impression. But the restlessness grew. Something wasn't right. Edward, in turn, allowed himself to live in the present. He looked rejuvenated, smiled more often, and talked about future plans with enthusiasm. He wanted to make up for lost time, teach Isabella all about the family business, involve her in important decisions, and most importantly, make sure she never felt alone again. However, there was one question that still tormented him in silence. What really happened that afternoon in the park so many years ago? How did your daughter disappear without a trace? And why has no one ever found her? Moved by these questions, Edward decided to resume the investigation. He sought out an old, trusted friend, now a private investigator, named Richard Doyle. A discreet, experienced man with a respectable record in cold cases. "Richard, I need you to find out all about the days following my daughter's disappearance." "Something in that story still doesn't make sense," Edward asked firmly. "Now that she's here, I can't rest until I know the whole truth." The detective promised to act quickly and confidentially. And in the days that followed, he delved into old documents, orphanage records, forgotten police files, and interviews with anyone who might bring any clues. Meanwhile, Isabella began to watch Thomas more closely. Small details caught his attention. He changed direction when he saw her, whispered to other employees, and showed discomfort whenever she entered a room where he was. It was as if his presence now posed a threat. On a rainy late afternoon, Isabella decided to talk to Edward about her suspicions. "Dad, there's something that's bothering me," he said, hesitantly. "I know it sounds paranoid, but since the exam confirmed everything, Thomas has been acting strange. He no longer looks me in the eye, he dodges, and the other day I heard him whispering on the phone. When I entered, he got nervous and hung up." Edward frowned, clearly surprised. "Thomas has always been someone to be trusted. He has been with us for more than 30 years. I never had reason to doubt him." "Right," Isabella replied. People like this know how to hide what they feel very well. But his behavior. It's not normal. I feel it. The father was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Perhaps we are facing something bigger than we think. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. There was something in the air. Something is about to emerge, like a truth smothered for too long. And she knew, with every fiber of her body, that this feeling was not for nothing. The next day, the sky dawned overcast, as if reflecting the restlessness that hovered inside the mansion. Isabella was more alert than ever. His intuition insisted on whispering that something serious had been covered up for too long, and that Thomas, the man everyone blindly trusted, might be the key to a past that no one dared to question. While breakfast was being served, the butler's behavior did not go unnoticed. He avoided any eye contact. His gestures were drier, almost automatic. Edward, watching in silence, began to notice the same signs that his daughter had mentioned. That afternoon, Richard Doyle, the investigator hired by Edward, returned with news. "I found something you need to see," he said as he met Edward in a low-key downtown coffee shop. He removed an old copy of a police report from his folder. "This here has never been analyzed in depth. They are notes from a resident near the park where Emily disappeared. He reported seeing a man leaving in a hurry with a child in his arms. He said that the subject wore gloves and a dark hat." Edward picked up the paper with trembling hands. "And his face? Did anyone identify him?" "The curious thing," Richard continued, "is that at the time, no one took this story very seriously. There was no precise description, no concrete evidence. But this resident. He still lives in the same house. I talked to him. And when I showed a current photo of Thomas, he hesitated." Edward felt his stomach turn. "Did you hesitate?" "How so?" "I said I couldn't guarantee it for sure, but the features, the gait, the physical size. They were very similar to what he remembered that day." Edward was silent for a few seconds, processing the information. The man who served his family loyally for so many years. Could he have been responsible for separating father and daughter? "Richard," he said firmly, "keep investigating. I want everything. Every detail. If he's involved, I want to know why. And I want justice." That night, Edward shared the discovery with Isabella. She listened to it all in silence, eyes wide, feeling the truth creep in like an inevitable wave. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "From the beginning, I knew he was hiding something." Edward nodded. The pain of possible betrayal was visible on his face. Thomas had been by her side for decades, knew every corner of the house, and knew every secret of the family. He was more than an employee. It was considered part of the structure of the house. And yet, it could have been him. The next morning, Isabella left early and went to the servants' room. He wanted answers. He needed to see with his own eyes if there was anything else hidden there. He took advantage of the moment when everyone was busy and entered discreetly. The simplicity of Thomas's room contrasted with its rigidity. Few personal belongings, everything perfectly arranged. But there was a locked drawer. Isabella searched for the key among the clothes, and after a few minutes, she found a small keychain hidden under the mattress. When she opened the drawer, her heart raced. There were old letters, notes with dates coinciding with the disappearance, and the most striking, a worn photo of a very small child wrapped in a blanket. The same blanket that Isabella vaguely remembered from the photos of the orphanage. She recognized it immediately. She left without being seen and gave everything to Edward. The two sat down at the library table, the papers scattered between them. The truth was drawn in silent details. Thomas knew. "I knew from the beginning where she was. And, more than that, he had been responsible for driving her away." That night, Edward sent for him. "Thomas, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. "And I hope, from our history, that you will be honest." The butler entered the room with the same expression as always. But his eyes, this time, seemed dull. He knew something had been discovered. "Were you at the park the day my daughter disappeared?" Edward asked, bluntly. Thomas hesitated. For the first time, he hesitated. But he tried to maintain control. I can explain. Then explain, said Edward firmly. Because we found evidence. And I want to know why you did it. Thomas took a deep breath. The facade collapsed, inch by inch. Finally, he began to speak, and the words that came out of his mouth would be impossible to forget. Thomas's confession fell on the house like a storm foretold long ago. He spoke in a low, hesitant voice, like someone who carried an old weight and now no longer had the strength to hold it. He said that afternoon in the park, he acted on impulse. I was seized with fear. After years of loyalty to the Bennett family, he felt that his place there was threatened with the birth of Emily. The affection, the attention, the inheritance. Everything he once imagined inheriting would now belong to a child. I didn't plan to. It wasn't something I worked out in advance, he murmured. But at that moment, I saw an opportunity. And I took it. Isabella felt her body tremble. The words echoed with cruelty. She had grown up far from her family because of the ambition of someone who lived just a few feet from where she was supposed to be. They were stolen years. Hugs that never happened. Lonely birthdays. Silent nights in a strange bed, when I could have slept listening to the voice of the parents saying that everything would be fine. Edward, for his part, couldn't hold back his tears. The firm man, the respected businessman, was now facing a betrayal that pierced all layers of trust. For a while, he tried to speak, but the voice just wouldn't come out. He only looked at Thomas as if trying to find, in the face of someone familiar, any trace of real repentance. The decision was made right there. Justice needed to be done. The next day, with all the documents gathered and the confession recorded, Edward and his lawyer went to the police station. The process would be formally initiated, and Thomas, even without resistance, would be held accountable for his actions. But what came after was even more difficult. Word spread quickly. Local newspapers ran headlines with the headlines, "Nearly 2-decade mystery solved," and "Traditional family butler accused of involvement in heiress's disappearance." The mansion, once surrounded by discretion, began to be observed from afar by reporters and onlookers. Employees began to act more cautiously, and some asked to leave. The environment became denser, loaded with looks and whispers. Isabella felt the impact of everything on her skin. Even though she was not to blame, it was as if the past was haunting her once again. Now, she was not just the daughter refound. It was the center of a story of scandal, of secrets revealed, but, contrary to what many imagined, she did not back down. He decided that he would no longer be a passive figure in his own trajectory. If her story had been interrupted in the past, now she would choose what the present and the future would look like. Firmly, she began to support Edward at every stage of the process. I participated in meetings with lawyers, reviewed documents, read articles, and sought to understand the legal and emotional implications of it all. He would not let another silence settle. He needed to act, even with fear still living in his chest. On a rainy afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea in her hands, Isabella looked out over the garden and thought about everything she had experienced in the past few months. Every pain, every revelation, every step. And there, in the midst of the chaos, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. She was no longer that girl who looked out the window of the orphanage waiting for someone. Now she was a woman who faced the truth, no matter how harsh, and refused to be defined by what was done to her. The past had left deep scars, but it also gave him a strength that few had. And this strength was now his ally to move forward, with dignity, courage, and the conviction that no pain would be greater than his desire to start over. As the weeks passed, Isabella found herself at the center of an emotional and social storm. The press, hungry for sensationalism, turned her story into gaudy headlines, distorting facts and romanticizing or dramatizing parts of her life that she had barely had time to process. While some newspapers spoke of the heiress found, others called her the orphan of fortune. None of them knew who she really was, but she knew. And that was enough. Edward, as much as he tried to protect her, also felt the effects of the scandal. Old clients began to hesitate, events were cancelled, and business meetings became more tense. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because society often prefers to ignore the truth when it bothers him. Despite everything, Isabella stood firm. He did not hide. He did not evade the cameras as he left the mansion, nor did he avoid questions. He only chose silence as a shield. He knew that, at that moment, the words would be distorted. And your best answer would be time. During this turbulent time, she grew even closer to Edward. The two began to share their routines, fears, and achievements. He taught her about contracts, strategies, and responsibilities. He wanted her to know everything, not just to inherit a name but to deserve it on her own merit. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said one evening as they reviewed documents from a new business partnership together. But if you want to learn, I'll be by your side every step of the way. Isabella smiled gratefully, but also with determination. She didn't just want to learn. She needed to feel part of it. He wanted to take his place with conscience and truth. In the midst of the intense routine, there were moments of exhaustion. Some nights, she cried alone, in silence, looking out the window of her room, trying to understand how it had all happened so fast. But even in those fragile moments, he found within himself a spark that refused to go out. One of the most difficult moments was when she returned to the orphanage, weeks after the revelation. She wanted to thank the director, the woman who took her in, guided her, and helped her get the job that changed her life. But returning to that place brought back dormant memories, the faces of the other children, the long cold corridors, the days of waiting with no answer. You've always been different, Isabella, the principal said fondly as she saw her walk through the door with a suppressed smile. Even on his most difficult days, he never stopped believing that something better would come. And it did. The words were simple but profound. Isabella felt a lump in her throat but also an unexpected relief. There, in that same space where she had felt forgotten for years, she now carried with her a story of upheaval, of reunion, of resistance. Before leaving, she spent a few minutes sitting in the garden of the orphanage. He looked up at the sky, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes for a few seconds. He was no longer that child waiting for someone. Now she was someone who had decided to wait only for herself, and to keep going, even with the world in contraction around her. Back at the mansion, Isabella's footsteps now echoed more firmly. The eyes of the others were still on her, but they no longer shook her. The pain had turned to fuel. The marks of the past were still there, yes. But now they were reminders of how much she was able to endure, and that was all she needed to move forward. What was once just an imposing residence, made of marble and silence, began to take on another form. The Bennett mansion, for many years marked by painful memories and mechanical routines, now breathed something different: movement, affection, color. Since Isabella had been recognized as part of the family, every corner of the house seemed to open up a little more. The heavy curtains that rarely let sunlight in began to be retracted. The windows began to be opened frequently, allowing fresh air to pass through the corridors that were once so static. Small details began to tell a new story. The living room, for example, which was previously only used for formal meetings or brief meetings, now became the meeting point for spontaneous conversations. On an ordinary afternoon, Isabella and Edward laughed, sitting on the couch, recalling unusual situations from her early days in the house, when everything was still strange. Sometimes they discussed ideas for the family business, other times, they simply played chess in silence, as if making up for the years they lost with sincere quality time. Isabella also started to go to the kitchen more, not out of obligation but out of habit. He enjoyed watching the preparation of meals, talking to the staff, those who remained, and suggesting simple recipes he learned at the orphanage. Gradually, even the most skeptical became accustomed to his presence. It did not impose authority. She conquered space with kindness and constancy, but perhaps the clearest sign of the transformation was in Emily's old room. After weeks of avoiding that room, Isabella finally found the courage to open it again. He entered slowly, smelling the soft smell of lavender mixed with thyme. Every object there seemed to whisper interrupted stories. As she walked to the bookshelf, her eyes were fixed on a notebook of children's drawings. He flipped through the pages carefully, seeing colored scribbles and lines without much logic but loaded with feeling. It was then that he had an idea. That same evening, he gathered Edward and his closest employees in the main room. I want to transform the room that was mine but that was frozen in time, she said in a firm but soft voice. I don't want to erase the memories, but to give them a new meaning. I want that space to reflect who I am today, and everything we are building together. Edward nodded with emotion. That room has always been waiting for you, my daughter. Now it can finally be yours for real, and so, they began a small renovation. No great luxuries, no exaggerations. Only adjustments that made the environment more welcoming, closer to Isabella's reality. The walls were painted in neutral tones, keeping details from childhood. The bed was replaced by a more suitable one, but the toys were kept on a special shelf as a reminder of the beginning of everything. The process was therapeutic. Every color choice, every piece of furniture repositioned, every object kept or removed was part of the journey. And after a few weeks, the room was no longer a reliquary of the past, it was a symbol of continuity, acceptance, and a new beginning. The garden has also undergone changes. Isabella and Edward took care of him together every morning. They exchanged plants, planted new flowers, and opened a small space for herbs and spices. The place that was once an untouched scenery, admired from a distance, was now lived in. And there, between vases and watering cans, father and daughter reconnected day after day. We cultivate, water, and wait for the weather to act, Edward said, with a serene smile. And when you least expect it, the roots are already deep, and the flowers begin to grow. Isabella knew that he was not just talking about plants. Inside the mansion, the sounds had changed. The piano, once covered by a white sheet, was now played by Isabella on weekend nights. The echo of the soft notes spread through the rooms, reaching even the most forgotten corners. It was music, but it was also healing. It was art, but it was also presence. Even the old portraits, which occupied the walls as witnesses to hard times, began to be accompanied by new photos. Isabella smiling with Edward in the garden, an impromptu family dinner in the kitchen, an afternoon walk in the city. The past was still there, but now it walked alongside the present. The mansion was no longer a place of loss. It was, finally, becoming a home. What was once called just the Bennett family home had become something much bigger, a space where feelings found home, where silence was now filled with light laughter, long conversations, and a routine full of meaning. As the days passed, the transformation of the mansion was no longer just aesthetic or symbolic. It became a lived, daily reality. And it was in the small gestures that this change was most present. Edward, for example, who for years had been a restrained man, had begun to show affection more freely. He touched Isabella's shoulder when he congratulated her on some task well done, praised her efforts in public, and even made a point of saying goodbye every night with a brief but sincere hug. Isabella, in turn, had become a reference for the other employees. Not because he exercises authority but because he knows how to listen. She knew the name of each person on the team, knew their habits, their schedules, even their culinary preferences. With empathy, she broke barriers, dispelled fears, and became, little by little, someone everyone trusted. It was even her idea to promote a special dinner for all those who had stayed in the house since before the revelation of her identity. It was a way of thanking them but also of rebuilding the trust shaken by the scandal that exposed the family. The hall was prepared with simplicity but elegance. Soft candles illuminated the long table, decorated with flowers picked from the garden itself. Isabella made a point of serving the dishes with her own hands, something that moved the guests. Edward, seeing her so at ease, realized that what his daughter carried was not only strength but also a rare sensitivity. "Today we are not bosses and employees," she said with a humble smile during a brief speech. "Today we are people who share the same space, the same story. Thank you for staying here." Even when everything seemed uncertain, the answer came in the form of applause and moved looks. That dinner, although simple, represented a milestone. The house, previously marked by invisible divisions, was now beginning to consolidate itself as an environment of mutual respect. In the following days, Isabella also became involved in social causes. Inspired by memories of the orphanage, she proposed to her father that they support institutions that welcome children without families. Edward not only accepted but also encouraged. "If someone had done this for you, maybe everything would have been different," he said, with a serene look. Now we can make a difference for others. Thus was born the Roots of Tomorrow project, a family initiative aimed at supporting children's shelters. Isabella led the visits, organized donations, talked to the children, and shared her own story, not as a wealthy heiress, but as someone who knew how to turn pain into strength. From this involvement, more changes emerged. Thomas's old office, which has remained locked since his arrest, has been revamped. Isabella transformed the space into a room for reading and reflection. He placed shelves with books that marked his life, photographs of important moments, and a comfortable armchair by the window. There, she spent hours writing, reading, or simply looking at the horizon, grateful for what she was building. At night, routines have also changed. It was common for Isabella and Edward to sit in the garden to talk before bed. Sometimes they talked about the advances in the social project, sometimes about the day that passed, or about childhood memories that Edward was gradually recovering with Isabella. "I remember you trying to catch butterflies here, by the lake," he said one night. "You fell, got up, and laughed as if the world were a light place." It was his laugh that made me feel that everything was in the right place. Isabella smiled, gently touching the necklace she never took off her neck. Maybe the world was really right at that moment, and now we're trying to get it right again. Over time, the ghosts of the house dissipated. The walls that once echoed loneliness now carried stories of reunion and overcoming. The past still existed, yes, but it no longer dominated. Now, it was the present that led the steps of each one there, and the Bennett mansion, once just a luxurious building, became, finally, what it should have always been, a home full of life, truth, and love. As the seasons passed, pain gave way to acceptance, and uncertainty, to maturation. The house that once seemed too big to hold only silences was now filled with new memories. Every object, every corner of the mansion now carried more than just the past, it carried life. Isabella, already more secure in her role, began to understand that she didn't need to mold herself to fit in there. She didn't have to be the perfect daughter, nor did she have to live up to unrealistic expectations. What made her special was precisely her trajectory. The way he faced everything that life imposed without ever losing the ability to start over. Edward, for his part, had ceased to live in the shadow of grief. The guilt, which for years consumed him for not having protected his daughter, did not disappear, but transformed. Now, he channeled this old pain into care, presence, and listening. He wanted to do for Isabella everything he couldn't do for Emily for so many years. On a sunny afternoon, sitting in the garden, he told her something she would never forget. "Sometimes I think about how many times I've been past people who maybe knew something, who maybe were closer to the truth than I imagined. And I wonder what it would have been like if I had insisted more. But I learned that time, while relentless, is also fair. He brought you back when I most needed to remember who I was." Isabella did not immediately respond. She just held his hand and stood there, in silence, allowing that moment to be fixed in her memory as something sacred. At the same time that she rebuilt her life inside the mansion, she also dedicated herself to the social project she had started. His visits to shelters became frequent. It was not just an action of charity, it was a reunion with one's own origin. Each child he met there brought a reflection of himself. And it was impossible not to be moved to see the hopeful eyes, the shy hugs, and the sincere smiles. On one of these visits, he met a girl named Clara. He was 6 years old, with curly hair and an observant manner. He didn't talk much, but he carried a notebook everywhere. In it, he drew what he felt. The first time they met, Clara drew Isabella holding her hand. When she asked why she had done that, the answer was simple: "Because you look like what I want to be when I grow up." It was like an emotional punch. Isabella smiled but felt her eyes fill. For the first time, he clearly understood the impact his story could have on the lives of others. It wasn't just about having reunited with the family. It was about becoming a point of light for those who still lived in the dark. Inspired by this, she decided to go a step further. He proposed to Edward that they renovate a disused wing of the mansion and transform it into a shelter for teenagers about to leave the foster care system. Those who, like her, were ready to face the world but still carried open wounds. "Let's call it New House," she suggested, smiling. "A place to start over." To transform pain into purpose, Edward accepted without hesitation. The idea gained strength, community support, and donations. In a short time, the wing was adapted, decorated with soft colors, books, games, comfortable beds, and large windows. The Casa Nova became a refuge. And Isabella, more than a founder, was a constant presence there. One night, after a long conversation with one of the young people sheltered, she returned to the main room of the mansion. He sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and looked around. Everything seemed so familiar now. But not because the place had changed completely. But because, finally, she had recognized herself there. She was no longer just the girl with the mysterious necklace. Now she was a daughter, mentor, builder of futures, and guardian of her own history, and the most beautiful thing about it all, she had done all this without giving up who she really was. The mansion was quiet that night. But it was not the heavy silence of before, made up of absences and painful memories. It was a quiet, almost welcoming silence, as if the whole house breathed peacefully after years of living on the edge of an abyss. Isabella walked barefoot through the halls, her feet touching the cold ground as her thoughts traveled even deeper paths. So much had changed. And so fast. Looking back was like trying to remember an old dream, in which everything seemed distant and blurry, until, suddenly, everything became real. He entered the newly renovated room, now completely his own, and sat down in the armchair by the window. Outside, the moonlit garden looked like another world. A calm setting, where each plant carried a story, where each flower was proof of a cycle that, even with ruptures, had started again. On the chest of drawers rested the necklace that, for so long, was his only link to an unknown past. She held him in her hands and watched him more fondly than ever. It was no longer just a piece of metal. It was the symbol of everything she faced. All that survived. Everything he rebuilt. Edward entered the room without knocking, as was already customary between the two. He brought 2 cups of tea, as he had done every night since they had made the opening of the Casa Nova official. "I couldn't sleep," he said, handing one of the cups to Isabella. "I had the feeling that tonight marks something. A closure, perhaps, or a new beginning." She smiled. She took a sip and looked at him tenderly. Maybe both. They stood there, side by side, in silence. Without having to say much. The connection between the two had already gone beyond words. It was made up of small gestures, of reconstructed memories, of divided plans. "You know," Edward began, staring out at the night outside, "for a long time, I thought I had lost everything. And even when I met you again, I was afraid that time had separated us too much. That it was too late to be father and daughter." Isabella put her hand on his. "It's never too late to really love. We don't recover time. But he can build what comes after him. And that, for me, is more than enough." The words hung in the air like a silent promise. The next morning, the mansion received a visit from some children from the Casa Nova. It was a planned visit, but it carried a significant emotional charge. They were guided by Isabella through the rooms, showed curiosity, asked questions, played in the garden, tried cakes made in the kitchen. And for a moment, the whole house seemed to be alive with voices and footsteps that, years before, had seemed impossible to hear there again. One of the girls, shy, held Isabella's hand and asked, "Did you live here when you were a child?" Isabella thought for a moment before answering. "No, but I think. In a way, my heart always knew that one day I would be here." At the end of the visit, the children left the mansion smiling. And with them, Isabella felt that something inside her was complete. It didn't matter how it all started anymore. What mattered was what she had done with everything that happened. Pain became learning. The absence became a purpose. And loneliness finally gave way to a home. That same evening, sitting again beside Edward in the garden, she looked up at the starry sky and murmured, "Sometimes, fate doesn't take us the shortest way, but it always gets us where we need to be." Edward smiled, holding her hand tightly. "And this time, he brought you home." The two remained there, unhurriedly, under the tranquil sky, with the certainty that their story, although marked by scars, was above all a story of reunion, forgiveness, and new beginnings. and there, in the mansion that for so long kept the echo of an absence, a new chapter finally blossomed. A chapter where the past was not forgotten but transformed. And where love, so postponed, now had room to grow. That I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to the channel to help our channel grow and not miss the next stories. See you in the next videos.